It's been a long while since my last video, but I'm happy to be back and doing the Django series with you. Let's begin with Module 1 and a brief introduction. You may be aware that Django is a web framework that is built using Python and by its very design makes common web development tasks fast and easy. So take the case where you're working on the user authentication module for your project. Django already has a lot of the machinery required for user authentication built into the framework. And so you can use the forms, the user interface, and have your module up and running in no time. Another important feature of Django is that it can be used without setting up a database because Django will use SQLite by default, SQLite coming installed with your Python installation, and we will be using SQLite throughout the series. But Django does provide support for other database management systems, including Oracle, MySQL, PostgreSQL, etc. You need to, of course, configure the settings within the Django framework according to the documentation for your database management system. Now, Django has its own object relational mapper, and using ORM, therefore, reduces development time while also aligning your code with your database structure. Talking about object relational mapping, and if you're not familiar with the term, let's look at a simple example to understand this concept. We have a database table here. Each of the columns is a field in this table, and each row is a record. We have the arrow there pointing to the record for John Doe. Using ORM or object relational mapping, it is possible to create an object that maps to the record for John Doe. Talking about that term class, this is an OOPS concept, essentially object-oriented programming. And in the case of Django, this is going to be a Python class. But the term class itself is essentially a blueprint or a template on the basis of which objects can be created. So using this class student, we can create objects which are essentially instances of the class. So in this particular example, we can have 3 instances of the class student, each mapping to one separate record in the database table. In effect, we have created 3 objects. So I hope ORM is clear to you. Now, using ORM, of course, then Django creates a virtual object database. So you see how easy it is then to work with the data. Now, how would the database layout be described? Maybe a question that crops up in your mind. Well, the database layout is described using Python code. Where is it described, you may ask? To answer that question, let's talk about the layers within the framework. And so we have first the model layer, and this is where we will describe the database layout. And so the model layer is concerned with the database structure definition as well as the manipulation of data of your application. We will be doing a separate session on models. The next is the view layer, and although it may seem that the view layer deals with the user interface, in the case of Django, the view is concerned with processing a user request and then returning the response. More about requests, responses, and views in the next session. The next layer is the template layer, and this is the layer that deals with the user interface. And so the template layer would have designer-friendly syntax that helps us render the data to the user in an appealing manner. In short, you can say then that the view layer determines which data to display to the user, and the template layer determines how that data is to be displayed to the user. The next layer is the forms layer. You may have worked with HTML forms, and the forms layer allows us to create forms and then manipulate the form data, either returning a response to the user or returning information back to the application for further processing. We then have the development process, and this layer provides us with tools for development and testing of our application. The next layer is the admin layer, the most loved feature of the Django framework. Django comes with its own automated admin interface, and we can use this interface to create users, assign permissions to them. We can also access our database tables through this interface. deleting, modifying, adding records to our database tables. The last layer is the security layer, and this layer provides us with tools and mechanisms for protecting our application against attacks like cross-site scripting attacks, CSRF or cross-site request forgeries, SQL injection, etc. Now let's talk about the Django architecture. You may have heard the terms model, view, controller if you worked with web frameworks. Let's look at these in terms of Django. The model part of the architecture, of course, deals with the database layout for the project, as we saw earlier. The view in terms of its architecture is a Python callback function for a particular URL or uniform resource locator. As I said earlier, we'll talk more about views as well as the callback functions in the next session. The controller is essentially the machinery that sends a request to the appropriate view. So if you think about it, the controller itself is the entire Django framework. And because the controller is the framework itself, rather than using the term MVC or Model View Controller to describe Django architecture, a more appropriate term to use is MTV or Model Template View. Coming now to who uses Django, the first example I'd like to give you is NASA. And for a specific application, NASA chose to use Django because they had one person working on the application. And the thinking was that Django being full stack, the one person could develop both the front end and back end using Django and using one core programming language, Python, right? Rather than having to use AngularJS on the front end maybe and Node.js on the back end. The next example I'd like to give you is Instagram uses Django to handle the large volumes of data, including your posts, reels, stories, etc. The last example I'd like to give you is National Geographic that uses Django not only to manage its high-resolution images, its modules, ads, essentially using Django to create its own custom content management system. Let's talk about now the technical parts of a Django project. Every Django project needs to reside within its own virtual environment. But what is a virtual environment? Simply put, it is a folder on your desktop, but it's not just any folder that you would create probably using Windows, for example. Rather, it is a folder created using a specific Python command that we'll come to shortly. But why do we need this virtual environment? Well, consider a situation where you're working on different Django projects, all of them running on different versions of Django. So how do you manage this situation? Right? So the idea of a virtual environment is that you have each Django project along with the version of Django it runs on within this virtual environment separate from the other projects. Also, by the way, making your project more portable. How do we create a virtual environment? Well, we need to run that Python command I spoke about. And for that, of course, we need Python. Now, if you don't have Python installed, then you can go to this link, which you will also find in the description of this video. And if you click on that link, it will take you to this page where you can download the latest version of Python. Now, if you already have Python installed, then what you need to do is go to your command prompt. In your Windows search bar, type in COMM and click open there to start a command prompt. Type in Python -version to get the version of Python that you have. If you have Python 3.9 like I do, or 3.8 even, that's fine. But if you have anything earlier than 3.8, then you need to reinstall Python. Why? Because the version of Django that we're going to be installing shortly is not compatible with Python versions earlier than 3.8. Once we have Python installed, we can go ahead and create a virtual environment. Just type in py for short, or you can type in Python if you like, py-m venv, that's the command, virtual environment, and give the virtual environment a name. I'm going to call that Django Proj 1. And now we will have the environment created, right? dir Django underscore project1 to see the contents of that folder. And you can see that Python has put in some folders there. And we also have something called scripts, right? So now that we've created the virtual environment, we need to next activate the virtual environment. To do that, come back to the command prompt and change directory to the virtual environment directory. And then type in scripts /activate. Press enter and you see the prompt changed, indicating that our virtual environment is active. What really happened here is if you change directory now to scripts, type in dir to see the listing, it's activate.bat. It's a batch file that ran and activated the virtual environment, also changing the prompt, right? CLS to clear the screen. Now that we have our virtual environment activated, one important point to remember is that whenever we start a new command prompt, we need to activate the environment again. So to test that out, go back to your window which has a command prompt, close it, and start a new command prompt. COMM in the Windows search bar and click open. We have a new prompt. Change directory to your virtual environment directory. Right? And you can see it's not active, right, by that prompt. So again, scripts /activate. Now our virtual environment is active, right? So every time we start a new command prompt, we need to run activate again. You can also use deactivate. Press the up arrow to go to the previous command and just put in a DE there. Press enter and we are back to the original prompt, right? Moving on. Now let's get to the installation of Django. Just to recap, before we install Django, we need to install Python. Which version of Python? Like I said, any version 3.8 or later is fine, or else you need to reinstall Python. Then we need to create a virtual environment, which we did. We need to activate the virtual environment, and then we can install Django using pip or the package installation manager for Python. So going back to the command prompt, make sure our virtual environment is active. So you can either type it again or just press the up arrow to come to that activate command. Press enter. Once it's active, you can type in py-m pip install Django. Now remember, pip doesn't need to be separately installed for the simple reason that it comes installed with Python. Press enter and Django will be installed. Right, now if you see this warning, just ignore it. That's to do with the pip version, right? And you can of course use this command to upgrade pip, but that's not important for now. Now to check or verify the version of Django, you can type in py-m Django -version. Right, and you can see there the version of Django that we have. Okay. Remember that for each new Django project, Django needs to be installed within that virtual environment, right, for that project. Great. Now some initial setup. We need to start a Django project. How do we do that? Going back to the command prompt. I'm going to clear the screen first. Just type in Django -admin with no space there. And you can see a list of commands. Among them, you can see down the list start project, and that's the command we'll use. Now, if you don't see these commands on screen, it would mean you're encountering some errors. You could be encountering this error or this one. To resolve a command not found error, make sure that the virtual environment is active and then run the command python-m Django. So going back to our command prompt, I'm just going to run py-m Django, and you'll see we get the same list of commands that we got when we used the command Django admin, right? So again, make sure that your virtual environment is active and then run this command. That should sort out that error. If you get this error, remember the operating system on a Mac is Unix, and Unix requires every file to be marked as executable before you can run it as a program. So what you need to do is open terminal.app, use cd to change directory to where Django admin is installed, and then run the command sudo change mode +x Django admin. So essentially what you're doing is you're adding the X attribute, that's the executable attribute, to Django admin, and that should resolve your problem. Going back to the command prompt, we can now proceed to use start project. So Django admin start project, give it a name. I'm going to call that school. And now if you type in dir to see the listing, you have a folder called school. Change directory to school to see the contents. And here you have something called manage.py. Now manage.py will do the same thing as Django admin, but in addition, it will set the Django settings module environment variable to point to your Django settings.py file. We'll look at the settings.py file shortly, but that's what manage.py does. So essentially it allows us to perform all administrative tasks related to our project, including running the project, and we will be using manage.py from now on. Then we have another folder called school. But what's with two folders by the same name? So the outer folder is a container, the inner folder is the actual package. So change directory now to school, and you will see some files there if you type in dir, right? Looking at those files, you have something called asgi.py. The full form is Asynchronous Server Gateway Interface. This is to do with deployment of your project. We also have wsgi.py, Web Server Gateway Interface, again to do with deployment of your project. Then we have urls.py, which will house the project URLs. We look at the content shortly. And then we have settings.py, that is the settings for your project, right? We have this file which has 0 bytes, and that's _dunder_init_dunder.py. And this is the file that tells Python that this particular folder or this particular directory is a package directory, right? Now to see the contents of settings.py and urls.py, I'm going to be using VS Code or Visual Studio Code. If you want to use another IDE, that's fine. But if you want to use Visual Studio Code and you don't have it installed, you will find in the description of this video a link to a step-by-step guidance for installing VS Code, right? Once VS Code is installed, cd ... to get back to the container, and then cd ... again to get back to that virtual environment we created, code space ... to start VS Code from this point. And you can see we have a virtual environment there. We have a container, and within that container, we have our package, right? Go to settings.py, you'll see Django has put in a lot of settings, including setting up the default database, right? Now we will be using SQLite, of course, as I said. We then have urls.py. The only URL we currently have is to the admin interface. We will devote a full session to the admin interface. Once we've started our project, the next step is to verify the project works. So come back to your command prompt and make sure you are in the container folder. Why? Because we need to be in the folder that has manage.py, right? And then type in py manage.py run server. This will start the Django development server. Yes, Django does provide us with a development server as part of the framework so that we can test our applications without having to set up another server. Press enter, and the server, you can see, is started at port 8000. Right now you can see we have a message there. You have 18 unapplied migrations. You can ignore that for now. We'll talk about migrations in a later session. But for now, what we can do is go to our browser and type in localhost 8000, just like that. Press enter. And you should see the screen indicating that our Django framework has been set up successfully. So in effect, a project has been set up successfully. The next step, of course, is to add apps to this project, which we will do in the next session. Some important points to remember. The Django development server is never to be used in the production environment because it's not been put through any kind of performance checks or audits. It's just a lightweight server given to us so that we can test our application immediately without having to set up a production server like Apache to test our application. By default, the server starts on port 8000, but we can change that. How? We go back to the command prompt, Control and C to stop the server, press the up arrow to access the run server command, add in 8080 there, press enter, and you can see now that the server started at port 8080. So go back to your browser, start a new tab, type in localhost, but change that to 8080, press enter, and you will see the same screen, right? Great. So now we've set up a project that ends module 1. In the next session, like I said, we'll start to build our app. So till then, take care. Bye.